the last while, ever since I ever since I got kind of put off work for since March, I've had a chance to look at a lot of the information that Deloria had talked about. I first met him in 2005. That's quite 15 years ago, I guess. And I was there teaching language with the Lummi students who were training some of the speakers there. But one of the things I think he was constantly talking about was until we indigenize our educational process, that the status quo would be pretty much stay in place. And he was not happy with that. And he was pretty critical towards the professional people who were really managing the educational system. I don't think it's because the professionals were the wrong people. It's just that they had to do what was required by law in Washington State and in the United States. So through that process, then a lot of our education, our traditional education, got sort of pushed into the back burner, pushed into sort of something just like ceremonies. And really it's about life, and I think Vine Deloria did a wonderful job in explaining that in that book called Power and Place. And the other books that he's written, as well as that Elizabeth Lee Cook, I think was her name. I met her a few years ago, and she did a wonderful job at talking about her experience with the educational system. But always been the thought that the elders would have to be involved in trying to restore or begin restoring some of the traditional methods of teaching. One of them was the inability of our young people to listen. They're so used to technology that they don't have to listen now. They just go to a computer like we're doing today and find the information they need. So, but more or less, then push the elders out of, they got displaced. And it's not that the elders, I think, want to take control of anything. It's just that they need to have a say, because some of the traditional methods of teaching are inherent. They're not something that can be written or transcribed onto into some kind of document. So I think that's kind of one of the problems that the elders have in communicating. That's why I asked my daughter to be here with me today, because I'm not used to this computer stuff. I had a computer once, about 20 years ago, and so much information coming in from all over the world. I just said, I don't need to know all this. So I threw my computer out and everything. And since then, I've tried to do my best in teaching the traditional knowledge way, whereby you have 2 or 3 people who are prepared to listen. The skill, I think, of teaching traditional method, teachers have to be trained how to do that, because today's children get bored very quickly. They want to go out and do something different. And some of our families are caught up in all kind of recreational activities, and we don't have time anymore to teach our children the things that they need to know. Just in this morning's paper, for example, in Saskatchewan, they were having a Sundance ceremony, and the government and police came in and told them they can't have a gathering. And they made it clear to the Canadian government and the police that they were not allowed to interfere in spiritual, cultural ceremonies. That was nothing to do with them. And so you see, a lot of our people are then asserting their right to do what they have to do in order to preserve not only their own cultures and languages and spirituality, but it's gotten to a point where the tribes across the country are clearly demanding their own space. They need to be given that space, and if it doesn't happen, then it creates a vacuum whereby nobody wants to talk to each other, and that's not good news. I think what we learned from the Gitxsan-Wet'suwet'en court case that went clean across Canada, including the United States, the government of Canada and the province of British Columbia have had to agree on traditional territory. And now it has become law that the traditional territory of the Gitxsan-Wet'suwet'en, as well as all of the native people, indigenous people across the country, has been given clear recognition that even though we have an elected system, or an elective system has been imposed on us, and it hasn't worked. Here in Canada, it's called the Indian Act. Indian Act, I'm not sure what it's called in the United States. I think it's a Bureau of Indian Affairs. But what is happening here in Canada now, which is pretty good, because the elected officials, what they're calling the democratic process, they're saying it's legal because it's under the Indian Act. But when you look at the Indian Act, it is only legislation. It has no constitutional protection. And that's what the Gitxsan-Wet'suwet'en were arguing. They needed to be consulted of the traditional territory. They weren't against the pipeline or anything. What they were against was the First Nations people did not give permission to the government of Canada or the companies that were installing the pipeline. So now they've reached an agreement to begin talking about what needs to be clarified in terms of traditional territory. The recognition is there. I think what it amounts to now is power sharing. How do we share our power now? Because this is actually a third government power structure has now been put in place. And I think it's critically important that we look at those kind of experiences that are happening in modern day, because what has been offered to us here in Canada is absolute surrender our right to everything that we are. And our people for the last almost 200 years have been saying, no, that's not acceptable. In fact, when we went to the constitutional table, which I was chairman for the Status Indians of Canada, when the Prime Minister at that time, Brian Mulroney, said that they would give us self-government, we said, how can you give us something that we already own and we know how to make it work? So he took it to the floor of Parliament in Ottawa. There wasn't one premier, and none of the territories were in agreement with him. So that conference, then the Constitutional Conference, went into limbo. But now we have Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, which gives us constitutional rights rather than legislative rights. Legislation rights can be changed anytime. It's something that over the years we've learned from previous leaders in Canada, British Columbia, as well as all across the country, who continuously said, we do not want to discuss amendments to the Indian Act because that has been clearly defined by professional people who study law in Canada. They've said it is the most racist document that has ever been written. So those kind of things we learned, and when Deloria talks about indigenize something, that's what it means. We have to take a look at how do we indigenize our own way of life without compromising, knowing that we have to have some kind of relationship with the government of Canada or the governments of North America. It's always going to be difficult, when you talk about the teaching from our ancestors, because most of our young people do not understand the language. One of the terms that have just come up in the last while is the whole idea of I'm trying to find it here. It's the thing that the show is called essential rights. So they're moving towards those things that are essential. Now, what does essential mean in our language and Indigenous language? We have to look at what it means, because it does not mean the same as in English or in French in terms of Canada. It's different. Essential requires certain things regarding not only our education, our health, our government structures. These are the essential things that have to be recognized and acknowledged. And that's what happened in the Gitxsan-Wet'suwet'en court case, that the government of Canada has finally agreed, okay, let's talk about what these essential needs are for the Gitxsan-Wet'suwet'en people and the Indigenous people of Canada, British Columbia. It's a difficult thing that we face because when you look at the status quo, what's been going on in Canada as well as the United States, the kind of racism and prejudice, hatred, murdering, all that happening, and it's a tactic of intimidation, which really is a scary way of trying to convince us to surrender. And I don't think that's going to ever happen. It's people across Canada are saying, no, enough is enough. We can't go down this road again. We're not prepared to amend the Indian Act to allow the federal government to continue the tactics that it's used against us over the last 200 years. And that has not been a good experience, because we didn't get this way overnight. This happened to us over many periods of indoctrination, teaching us, making us go to church, teaching us that we must surrender our language, culture, our history, let it go. I've been criticized, or people have, pardon me, people have told me, Chief Sampson, you should let go of the past and let it go, and let's move forward together. I said, I fully agree with that. I totally agree. However, what happened 100 years ago is going to happen tomorrow morning. And it continues to happen in Canada, in this country. The policemen are constantly being told, no, you've got to stop. You can't do this anymore. People like I think it was in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, where that young guy got shot by a farmer, and the policeman said he probably deserved it. So you can see then the justice system is not exactly the kind of system that would help us move into the future together with the newcomers who have come to our country. And I think that's where a lot of the a lot of the difficulty that we're having, because it's not only the non-Indian people we're trying to educate now. We have to re-educate our own children, our young people, because our own young people have become the colonizer. And that's a tough thing to have to say. And it's happening, you know, not only here in Canada, but it's happening all across the country. The whole issue of the Indian Act that divides our community like something fierce. It's a tactic used by the government, knowing that now that we've educated the young people, let them look after the elders and do what they want with them. And that's exactly what's happening. The young people are finding out slowly but surely that they're going to have to listen, because our history and our way of life is not dependent on what's taught in the schools. Yes, schools are important for communicating with other people, but when it comes to survival, to true survival of our people, we have to look back at the history that we know. And since 2005 to this day, and looking at Vine Deloria's books that he's written, I forget what conference that was at Lummi there at the college. The guy from Alaska, I think it was the professor at Alaska University. And when he was making his presentation, he clearly said, for those people who live in Alaska in the north, he said, we need to have cold. If we don't have cold, we'll die. And it's not only people up in the northern parts of this continent that know that. In fact, when you look at the information coming out of Canada, you know, all the major cities across Canada, like Vancouver, Ontario, Alberta, all the provinces where there's a major population, the temperatures have changed there so drastically that people get sick real easy. And up in Alaska and up in the Northwest Territories, they're still at zero. They haven't had no virus there. And that's what this guy, this professor was talking about from Alaska, University of Alaska, who said, we need cold. If we don't have cold, we're going to die. And I always remembered that because, you know, we've changed so much in our last lifetime, in my lifetime. The other information I think that came out of Vine Deloria Symposium was a young guy from Yakima. I forget his name now. He was a young young scientist, and he was talking about climate change. And they were monitoring the mountains up in Washington State and the Yakima area. And he clearly made it clear to us at that meeting that the temperature at the higher levels was cold. And as the water came down from the mountains, it got warmer and warmer and warmer till it was too warm by the time it entered our rivers and our lakes and eventually into the ocean. And that was a good information that came from that young guy who was from Yakima. I can't remember his name now. It's about 10 years ago. But, you know, we've been constantly telling government, you know, I've done it here myself here in one of the Indigenous Voices program I was on. Because in 1945, I was 12 years old in 1947, and the elders were talking about the water was getting warm already. And how they monitored that was they kept track of their fishing location and the ocean, where certain temperatures of the water was too warm and caused the fish to move out into deeper water. And now here where I live in the Saanich Inlet, we have seine fishery here every year. The nets are not deep enough now to go down to get the salmon that go to the bottom of the ocean. And here in the Saanich Peninsula, Saanich Inlet. So what they do is they put send bombs to the bottom and scare the fish up from the bottom so they can net them in their seine boats. So these kind of things are happening all the time. But because because I never got out of high school, the people say, well, how come you talk so much and you know so much? I said, well, I grew up with a great grandma who never spoke English. She only spoke our language, Sampson and Halkamina. So I learned from her, and I learned from my grandparents about fishing and hunting. I had to know that because it was a way of survival. Today, a way of survival is welfare. You get a welfare check, or somebody subsidizes a program that's really designed not to go anywhere. It's designed more to keep you in control. And this is what the elders said. One day you're going to ask for your freedom, and it's not going to be there. And one of the statements made by one of the chiefs from the Chilcotin area as well, Williams Lake area, and she's her name was Judy Wilson. She's the secretary treasurer for the Union of BC Chiefs, and chief of the Nisquamish Nation in BC Interior. And she said she will continue doing what we need to do to uphold the collective rights of our First Nations people. She said that, that the Indian governments or the governments are not going to succeed because they're controlled either by provincial law or federal law. In the case of the United States, I guess that's controlled by the state of Washington, where they have a lot of control over the treaties. And these are the things that Vine Deloria has raised over the last, just before he passed away in 2005. And I think it's important, that we take a look at how we can truly include meaningful talk with the elders, because they do know. It's not, some of them, when I've talked to them, when I'm down there in Lummi, they said, I go in and do the prayer, and then that's about it. That's about the height of my involvement with our people. And it's insulting. It's not bad. It's just that all of us know how to pray. We may not all be good Christians, but we still know how to pray. And I think it's important that the kind of messages that Vine Deloria sent out, that when he said you have to indigenize the process. And that's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of hard work. It's not going to be easy, because we've had people at the symposium, since I've been going there since 2005, I've met people from all over the world that go to that conference. And it was a valuable time for me, because it tells us of the experience that different people are having across the world, whether they're in North America, South America, Africa, no matter where they come from. They came there and they said, this is what's happening. So what does then the status quo offer us today? Well, in Canada, the government of Canada is learning the lesson the hard way. They got to stop polluting the land. The elders said about 40 years ago at a tribal council meeting, and I said this on the Indigenous Voices, I said, the people who come to this country are going to be knee-high in their own waste, and they won't know the difference. And that's where we are today. You know, in the wintertime, you look out in the bay where I live, and the water that comes from the Fraser River ends up here in this inlet. The water is just brown that comes from the Fraser River. And nobody pays attention to that. When you go on a ferry or you fly over from Victoria, you can see a clear line of mud that's coming from the Fraser River because of the management of the interior of British Columbia. Mining, logging, all those things affect us here on the coast. So I think if we look at having a conference, I think whenever this happens again, that we bring those people, knowledgeable people that know the history of not only who they are, but the history of the relationship with the land. It's important that we do that because the people they got in this morning's news, the Prime Minister said that they were going to look at the essential needs, and the scientists are going to determine what those essential things are. Well, when I watch the selection of the scientists, some of them are corporate-owned scientists. Corporation manages their work that they do, and the corporations want the kind of information they want, not what needs to be known, but what the corporate world wants. You can see it happening here in Canada, all across North America. So you have these corporate scientists, you have corporate professors, you have all of these things, and I'm not against it, by the way. Don't misunderstand me here. I'm just pointing out what we have seen and what we have learned from it. It's not been a good experience, you know, this whole issue of the rule of law. The rule of law made by who and by what? The rule of law of the Indigenous people must be taught and remembered because it's about us. It's not about the rule of law of the corporate world. That's not what it's about. And I think we need to have those kind of discussions. And Vine Deloria, you know, when I listened to him that first time, the only time I heard him, I thought, this is just like my great-grandmother talking to me. That's who he reminded me of, the way he was talking. Trying to impress into us that it has to be done this way. There are no other choices. If we don't do it that way, then we have to be prepared to suffer the consequences. And that's exactly where we are today. We're paying for our inability not to listen to our ancestral teaching. Some people say, well, you know, Tom, some time ago, forget it, let it go. You know, this morning I'm talking to you on a computer. And that's why I asked my daughter to come here. I'm not good at computers. I was one time, and I got so angry with it, I threw it out, and I canceled everything that had to do with computer because I became dependent on it. I said, I better see what they're doing in Europe. Well, what the heck good does that do us here in the Sandwich Peninsula? So anyhow, Daryl and Victoria, I'm sure glad to see you guys this morning. You know, I've been kind of lonesome for you guys. I'm kind of worried about some of the families over there. A lot of them are my own family. The kids who live down by the waterfront there. My wife's sister was married over there. So some of those kids are my nieces and my nephews that are over there, including grandchildren now. So I was kind of wondering, I was phoning over there this year, if you're not getting any of this virus stuff, you know. But I think my 20 minutes are up.
Tom?
Yeah,
Yeah, you want to close in the language?
okay.
Yeah.
Hex and Kuche, Siam Nishelicha. I was Asa Quil etia Kuchil. The squil Telex and the Jala Mukula, Exalak of Telesit. I was Nisquit. Ya Tungstala Oxahisla. Ya Tungsta. Quansits Kuche Unex Chasing. I was the class of the Schuningslax, the Salele, Constrelea, Consulsela, and Jalam, Aquia, Tapiak, Nils Slaes, the Snapanapta. I was Pace. To his Sakuchekos Hali, who Quansatahu, Quansats Kuche. La Cox Le, Sesox, Squel, Lex, and Elinganak, Chacos Kuche. Those square and square, those square and snapanap. Nil square square sichlax and a jam. My great grandmother told me a long time ago, don't ever forget who you are and what you are. The words that I'm giving you, talking to you about, came from my great grandparents, which goes back to about the 16th century. So what I'm talking about and trying to remind ourselves about is not just Tom Sampson talking. It's about the history and the knowledge of the centuries of living with the land. If we don't live with and understand the land, we will surely die. That's what my great grandma said. So I want to thank you, Daryl, for reminding me of that. You know, sometimes I get caught up.
Well, thank you, Tom.
Yep.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. That was wonderful. We really appreciate your words.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope when we get time together again, when things kind of ease up, sit down, look at a hard look at what Indigenous languages and culture means. We got to look at it. You can't study it anymore. It's been studied to death. You know, there's a lot of smart Indians in this country, but as soon as they get too smart, they get hired by the government, and that shuts them up for good. They don't talk no more. So anyway, I'm not angry about that. I just recognize that, you know. So, anyway, I'll talk to you guys later.
Okay.
Thank you, Tom.
Hayako.
Very cool.